On a cold, silent night in Willowview, as everything seemed to be at rest, a chilling secret began to stir within the town's old walls, shaking them with fear. Martin Parkhurst, who was once considered a friend and guide to all, was found murdered one evening under mysterious circumstances, and no one knew who was behind the deadly plot. Agatha Marple, a sharp and determined detective, was ready to unravel the terrifying puzzle. But each question she uncovered only led to darker, more dangerous secrets. Was everything as it appeared? Or were there hidden truths far more terrifying than Martin's death itself? It was early February in the year 1927, and the small town of Willowview lay beneath a blanket of freshly fallen snow, a serene and quiet picture that seemed almost timeless. The streets, still adorned with the bright decorations in preparation for the annual Groundhog Day festival, had a strange duality, an odd mixture of rustic charm and understated glamour. Bright bunting fluttered gently in the cold wind, while elegant shop windows displayed handcrafted wooden groundhog figurines. Electric lamps, still a novelty in this sleepy town, cast a warm, inviting glow across the cobblestones. Yet, despite the festive atmosphere, a chill hung in the air, an unease that would soon find its voice in a shrill, terrified scream that split the stillness of the morning. At the heart of the disturbance stood the grand Parkhurst residence, a sprawling mansion ivy-clad and regal in its appearance. Inside, the modern rooms were dressed with plush rugs, polished Art Deco lamps, and tapestries rich in color, yet there was a stark contrast to the usual liveliness of the house. The figure of Martin Parkhurst, the beloved impresario of Willowview's festival, lay slumped at his cluttered desk. His face had drained of all color, leaving a ghastly pallor beneath the harsh light of the room. A series of typewritten notes detailing festival logistics fluttered to the floor, forgotten, their purpose now rendered meaningless. Dorothy Parkhurst, Martin's wife, stood outside the study door, pale and trembling, unable to cross the threshold, her every instinct telling her not to approach the scene of horror. Her anxious presence in the hallway reflected the undercurrent of terror spreading through the house. In a town as small as Willowview, news of such a tragedy would travel swiftly, rumors whispering on the crisp morning air, circulating faster than any person could. Across the hall, young Constable Miller, still fresh in his role, and eager to prove himself, stood frozen in front of the body, looking down at the lifeless form of Martin. No blood, no obvious wound. It seemed like a cruel twist of fate, perhaps the toll of stress and exhaustion. But the unnatural bruise on his right temple suggested otherwise. There was something far darker at play here. In the midst of this growing tension, Miss Agatha Marple, who had arrived in Willowview only the night before, stood silently, observing. A visitor to this quiet town, she had come to offer her insight on local customs and folklore, expecting little more than a relaxing holiday. However, drawn by the shriek of terror, she found herself at the scene of the tragedy. Agatha was no stranger to distressing events. Her keen grey eyes, sharp and observant, took in every detail, the half-written schedule scattered across the desk, the bruise that marred Martin's temple, the uneasy quiet that had settled over the room. The constable appeared utterly bewildered, his youthful face flushed with a mix of confusion and dread. He could find no clear answer, no obvious cause of death. At first glance, it seemed as if Martin had simply passed away, the result of a long, exhausting season of preparations. But the bruise at his temple, deep and dark, suggested something much more sinister. Agatha's experience, sharpened over years of observing similar scenes, told her that this was no accident. Death, as often as it appeared natural, often concealed darker truths beneath its surface. The snow continued to fall gently outside, softening the once lively clamor of the town. The busy chatter of shopkeepers and villagers, once filled with the excitement of the festival, had dwindled into an uneasy murmur. The wind whispered through the streets, scattering snowflakes like fragile dust. In the distance, Agatha could hear faint remarks about Martin's frailty, his so-called delicate constitution, and whispers about the mounting pressure of organizing the festival. But amidst all the chatter, one fact stood out with stark clarity. Martin Parkhurst was dead, and whether the cause was natural, or something more ominous remained the question. The mayor, his face pale with shock, approached Agatha cautiously. His bowler hat, dusted with melting snow, seemed almost out of place in the growing tension. His voice was low, barely a whisper, as if he feared the very air might reveal too much. "Miss Marple," he said, glancing nervously toward the study. "I understand you are here to speak of ancient customs, but, well, given the circumstances, might we trouble you to assist us? We need someone with your expertise. The town is in turmoil." Agatha's eyes lingered on the frozen streets outside the window, where the familiar bustle of the village had been replaced by an eerie silence. Her gaze flickered back to the body. Despite the tragedy that had unfolded within these walls, she could not help but feel the stirring of her professional curiosity. This was no simple death. The bruising on Martin's temple, the room's tense atmosphere, the scattered papers, all pointed to something far more complex than an unfortunate accident. "Very unfortunate," Agatha replied, her voice steady, yet laced with genuine sympathy. "I had hoped to explore the customs of Groundhog Day, but it seems your festival has taken a darker turn." She looked meaningfully toward the body again, her mind already working through the possibilities. The death of Martin Parkhurst had cast a shadow over the town's beloved festival, but there was more at play here than anyone yet realized. The silence in the hallway was punctuated by Dorothy's muffled sobs, her grief palpable. Yet, Agatha remained composed, her mind sharp and focused. She had seen enough in her years of quiet observation to know that tragedy often hid a deeper story. As the snow continued to swirl outside, a faint hum of gossip floated through the air, but Agatha was already lost in the labyrinth of questions that needed answers. The town of Willow View had just been thrust into a mystery far more profound than anyone could have anticipated. And Agatha Marple, methodical and unassuming, was about to uncover the secrets buried within. Through the house a nervous energy pulsed, seeping into every corner, fueling the oppressive atmosphere. Servants in their starched aprons moved with frantic precision, their footsteps almost too careful, unsure whether to extend condolences or prepare the parlor for the inevitable parade of visitors. The thick silence that had settled over Willow View deepened, as though the very snowflakes falling outside conspired to keep the town's darkest secrets concealed. Even the snow seemed to absorb the tension, laying a heavy veil over the streets, muffling every sound with an unsettling calm. The festival committee, usually so brimming with excitement for the upcoming Groundhog Day celebrations, now stood awkwardly at the foot of the grand curving staircase. Their exchanged glances were laden with fear and uncertainty. Without Martin Parkhurst's steady guidance, how could they carry on? Yet beneath their concern, there lingered a trace of guarded hope, a quiet yearning that somehow, despite the tragedy, the festival would go on. It had long been the pride of Willow View, a symbol of prosperity and joy, drawing crowds from neighboring towns, boosting trade, and filling the coffers for another year. But Agatha Marple, who stood silently observing, felt the mix of emotions swirling in the cold, heavy air, the sorrow at the loss of their dear friend, the reluctance to see his life's work falter, and perhaps beneath it all, a hint of self-interest, a desire to see the festival continue for personal gain. She had seen this before, grief and ambition entwined, each person's motives twisted by the icy hand of circumstance. "Well then," Agatha's voice broke the tension, her words calm but carrying a weight of quiet resolve. "We have no choice but to investigate this unfortunate event, as discreetly as possible, of course." She allowed a flicker of dry wit to play across her lips. After all, a town with such an important festival ahead cannot afford too much unpleasantness. Her gaze met the mayor's, firm, unwavering. Outside, the sound of a carriage rattled by, its wheels crunching against the icy road, the noise jarring against the otherwise tranquil scene. The quiet presence of onlookers gathered at the windows, their faces pale and expectant, etched with both dread and a strange, almost morbid curiosity. And so, beneath the faint flicker of a lone light bulb, Agatha Marple prepared herself to unravel the dark secrets veiled within Willow View, determined to piece together the mysterious circumstances of Martin Parkhurst's untimely death before suspicion or fear could tear the town apart. The subdued hush still clung to Willow View as Agatha entered the morning room of the Parkhurst residence. The vintage wallpaper, a faded blend of gilded patterns and curling vines, seemed almost to press inward, suffocating the room with a sense of mounting anxiety. Outside, the gentle snowfall continued to drift lazily down, muffling the usual bustle of horse-drawn carriages, and the occasional motorcar rumbling down Main Street. But despite the snow's delicate touch, an electric tension hummed in the air, and rumors of Martin Parkhurst's suspicious death spread through the town far quicker than Constable Miller would have preferred. In the small room by the window, Dorothy Parkhurst sat rigidly, her posture stiff, as if trying to hold herself together against the overwhelming grief. Her once vibrant demeanor, known for orchestrating grand tea dances and charity events, had vanished, leaving behind only a pale, fragile silhouette. She offered Agatha a weak, trembling smile, that barely held as she dabbed at her eyes with a lace handkerchief. "He was always so careful," Dorothy said, her voice faltering. "He took great pride in his health, you know." She sniffled, words tumbling out in a frantic staccato, her desperation veiled beneath a thin mask of politeness. Agatha, who had seen this kind of behavior countless times, offered a nod of understanding, but her sharp, perceptive eyes caught the subtle shifts in Dorothy's composure, her trembling hands, the avoidance of eye contact, the repeated insistence that Martin's death was natural. It didn't ring true. "I quite understand, Mrs. Parkhurst," Agatha said gently, though her mind was already turning over the inconsistencies. "But there is the matter of that unfortunate bruise." Dorothy's hands flew to her mouth, her breath coming in shallow gasps. "Yes, so they say," she whispered, glancing around the room as though fearing the walls themselves might be listening. "But I cannot imagine who would wish Martin harm. Surely it was just a misunderstanding, something trivial. I hate to indulge in idle gossip, especially with everything going on." Agatha let the silence stretch, her watchful eyes never leaving Dorothy's nervous fidgeting. The woman's insistence on the naturalness of her husband's death seemed forced, but Agatha knew better than to jump to conclusions. She simply let the silence fill the room, waiting for Dorothy to say more. Before Dorothy could elaborate, the sharp sound of footsteps interrupted them. Jonathan Wicks, tall and composed, entered the room. His polished shoes and impeccably tailored coat announced his wealth before he even spoke. With a brief respectful bow toward Dorothy, his presence immediately shifted the atmosphere. His air of authority, his carefully curated politeness, seemed at odds with the heavy grief in the room. Yet as he stepped further into the space, it became clear, the subtle swirl of ambition and control he carried with him could easily overshadow the fragile air of mourning. Agatha's sharp gaze shifted to him, taking in every movement, every shift in his demeanor. The truth of Martin Parkhurst's death was buried deeper than anyone in this room had yet to uncover, and Agatha Marple was determined to find it, no matter how many carefully crafted facades she had to tear down. The air in the Parkhurst residence was stifling, thick with grief and unspoken tensions, a feeling that clung to the ornate furniture and the flickering shadows cast by a dying fire. Mrs. Parkhurst sat hunched at the edge of a velvet armchair, her fingers nervously twining a lace handkerchief, her pale face a mask of sorrow and confusion. Jonathan Wicks, standing just inside the doorway, surveyed the room with cold detachment, his sharp eyes momentarily meeting Agatha's with a calculated gleam. "I do hope you're bearing up, Mrs. Parkhurst," he said, his voice lacking warmth, yet laced with the undercurrent of something more, something transactional. His gaze flicked to Agatha again, and in that brief moment, there was a glimmer of something darker, as if he were sizing her up. "If there's anything I can do, the festival perhaps. I know Martin was quite devoted to it. We simply must continue, for Willow View's sake," he added, his words careful, measured. Dorothy, her face a ghostly pallor, nodded in agreement, but the faint tremble in her voice betrayed her unease. Yes, I suppose we must," she whispered, dabbing at her cheeks, her attempt at composure faltering. Agatha watched them both keenly, the subtle shifts in their expressions not lost on her. The strained civility between Wicks and Dorothy spoke volumes. "Indeed," Agatha murmured, her voice smooth yet layered with quiet suspicion. "There has been talk of grand plans for expansion. I believe, though, it would require significant investment." Wicks's chin lifted, his gaze distant, as if the weight of money and ambition hovered around him like an invisible cloak. "Yes, extravagant, some might say," he responded, a small, almost imperceptible smile playing on his lips. "But one must speculate to accumulate." There was a pause, the words hanging in the air, thick with meaning. Agatha's mind was sharp, and she noted the way Dorothy shifted uncomfortably, her fingers tightening around the handkerchief. Was this resentment toward Martin's recent hesitance to back the festival's grand expansion? The tension between them simmered beneath their polite facades, as if unspoken accusations danced just beneath the surface. A distant clock chimed, and the hush in the room deepened, an uncomfortable silence enveloping the group. It was then that the heavy oak door creaked open once again, revealing Kelly Stokes, the town's no-nonsense zookeeper, her face a study of determination mixed with palpable frustration. She was dressed simply, her practical coat and boots standing in stark contrast to the gilded surroundings of the Parkhurst home. "Miss Marple," Kelly began, her voice tinged with urgency, "I need to speak with Mr. Parkhurst about the disruptions to Winston's enclosure. The fireworks last night, they unsettled him more than usual." Her eyes, a striking shade of green, flicked toward Martin's study, then met Agatha's with a glance that spoke volumes. Agatha nodded, her tone sympathetic yet probing. "I understand your concerns, Miss Stokes. The welfare of Winston is paramount, especially given the festival's growing prominence." Kelly's hands tightened around her notepad as she continued, the frustration in her voice rising. "Martin was adamant about expanding the festival, but I warned him repeatedly that such changes could compromise the charm of Willowview. Last night, after our conversation, I left his study feeling uneasy." Her words trailed off, her gaze flicking toward Dorothy, whose presence seemed to weigh heavily on the room. Before Agatha could respond, another figure appeared in the doorway. Lawrence Atkins, the town historian, a man known for his quiet authority and scholarly bearing. His silver hair was neatly combed, his spectacles perched on the bridge of his nose, and he carried himself with an air of dignity that seemed almost at odds with the growing tension in the room. "Good morning, everyone," Lawrence greeted smoothly, his voice steady, yet with a spark of enthusiasm in his eyes as they landed on Agatha. "Miss Marple, it is an honor to have you assist us in this matter. The history of Willowview is of utmost importance." The room was charged with anticipation, the unease between the gathered figures palpable. Each of them, it seemed, had a part to play in this increasingly tangled mystery. But the question remained, who was truly behind Martin Parkhurst's untimely demise? As the bitter wind howled through the trees outside, a palpable sense of dread seemed to settle in the grand drawing room of the Parkhurst estate. The silence inside was heavy, suffocating, as though every inch of the room was aware of the secrets that had yet to be uncovered. The ornate furniture, draped in rich velvet and intricate tapestries, seemed almost too grand for the tension that hung in the air. Agatha Marple stood by the tall windows, her sharp eyes taking in the flickering shadows cast by the weak afternoon light. The snow outside, a soft, unrelenting sheet, muffled all sound, enveloping Willowview in an eerie stillness. Yet within the estate, the undercurrents of tension and unspoken fears reverberated louder than the wind ever could. The guests had gathered, each with their own carefully curated personas, but Agatha could see beyond the surfaces. Jonathan Wicks, the ambitious town sponsor, sat by the fire with a calculated smile, but his eyes betrayed something deeper, a hint of discomfort, perhaps a secret buried just beneath his calm exterior. Agatha had noted his keen interest in the festival, but something about his eagerness felt too rehearsed. Was he hiding something? His sharp glance toward Dorothy Parkhurst, the widow still grieving her husband's sudden departure, didn't go unnoticed. Dorothy's composure was fragile at best, her pale face often veiling the inner turmoil that bubbled just beneath. The sense of loss hung heavy around her, but Agatha, ever perceptive, sensed that Dorothy was hiding something more, an anxiety that bordered on fear, an uncertainty in her every movement, a vulnerability she hadn't yet allowed anyone to witness. Kelly Stokes, the devoted zookeeper, had entered just moments before, her demeanor tense, her eyes darting nervously between the others. She had spoken of Winston, the town's beloved groundhog, and the recent break-in at his enclosure with a palpable sense of dread. Agatha had detected more than a simple worry about the animal's safety. There was something about Kelly's reticence that spoke volumes. She seemed to be holding back, unwilling, or perhaps too afraid, to speak the full truth. Her conversation about the fireworks had been filled with more than just frustration. There was an undercurrent of something much darker. Kelly's words hinted at a deeper betrayal, one that extended beyond Martin Parkhurst's sudden withdrawal from the festival. Her gaze flickered with a mixture of grief and anger, as she spoke of the way Martin had dismissed her concerns. It wasn't just about the fireworks. There was something deeper there. Agatha's mind was already working, pulling at the threads of each conversation, each glance, each hesitant word. Lawrence Atkins, the town historian, had arrived shortly after Kelly, his quiet demeanor and scholarly air almost at odds with the charged atmosphere of the room. His presence had initially been calm, even soothing, yet Agatha could feel the tension radiating from him as he spoke of his work with Martin on the festival's official program. There had been an eagerness in his voice, a longing to be seen as a key player in the town's history. But Agatha's instincts told her that Lawrence's attachment to Martin went beyond professional admiration. His loyalty to the late Parkhurst was too unwavering, too determined. What did he stand to lose if the festival, and Martin's vision for it, were to fail? The snow outside continued to fall, a quiet contrast to the growing storm within the walls of the estate. Agatha, however, remained still, her eyes moving from one guest to the next, reading the room as if it were a book she had already begun to unravel. The subtle play of emotions, grief, resentment, guilt, ambition, was becoming more evident by the minute. Agatha could sense it in the way they spoke to one another, in the way their eyes darted nervously, in the way their hands clenched in uneasy gestures. There were more layers to this mystery than she had originally anticipated, each one buried beneath the surface of what appeared to be a simple festival dispute. The more she listened, the more the fragments of the story began to fit together, each piece revealing a more intricate, more dangerous web of deception. When Dorothy spoke of Martin and Lawrence's collaboration, her voice softened, tinged with both pride and sorrow. It wasn't just the festival that had been their shared focus. It was their vision for Willowview's future, their legacy. But Agatha knew that with every great ambition came the potential for betrayal. As she listened to Kelly speak of the break-in at Winston's enclosure, Agatha felt the tension in the room increase. Kelly's words, though seemingly innocuous, were filled with deeper implications. It wasn't just the groundhog's safety that was at risk. It was the integrity of the festival, the town's traditions, and perhaps even the very foundation of Willowview's future. Was the tampering at the enclosure a random act? Or had it been an intentional strike against Martin and his vision for the festival? Was someone trying to send a message, to sabotage not just the festival, but the very people behind it? As the conversation wore on, Agatha's mind sharpened. The financial pressures of the festival expansion, the recent disturbances at Winston's enclosure, and the mounting personal tensions were not just isolated incidents. They were part of a larger, more complicated story. The more she thought about it, the more she realized that the motivations of those gathered in the room were as tangled as the web of secrets they were all trying to hide. Agatha allowed herself a moment of reflection, taking in the faces around her, the grieving widow, the ambitious sponsor, the devoted zookeeper, and the meticulous historian. Each one had their own reasons for being here, their own fears, their own secrets. But one thing was certain, someone in this room had a lot to gain. If Martin Parkhurst's festival vision, and possibly Martin himself, were to fall apart, the weight of her task settled over Agatha like a heavy cloak. She had learned much in the short time she'd spent with these people, but there was still so much left to uncover. The morning had passed with an unsettling calm, but Agatha could feel the storm rising. Each word, each glance, each subtle movement in the room was a piece of a larger puzzle, and with each passing moment, she became more certain that the truth was far darker and more twisted than anyone was willing to admit. As the room fell into uneasy silence, Agatha's gaze lingered on the assembled group. Outside, the snow continued to fall in a relentless, suffocating blanket, muffling the world beyond the estate's walls. But inside, the air was thick with tension, and Agatha knew that beneath the cold exterior of Willowview's picturesque facade lay a story of betrayal, ambition, and dark secrets waiting to be uncovered. With every step she took closer to the truth, the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place, but just as quickly, they seemed to slip away. Agatha could feel the weight of the mystery pressing down on her, but one thing was certain: she was going to unravel it, no matter how deep the deception ran. By the time afternoon settled over Willowview, Agatha found herself reflecting on the subtle yet unsettling clues that had surfaced in the wake of the tragic events. The bruised temple of the deceased, the tampered groundhog enclosure, the mounting financial disagreements over the festival's expansion, and the seemingly perfect yet possibly fabricated alibis of those involved. It all painted a picture far more intricate and dark than anyone could have imagined. Each piece seemed to carry a heavier weight, like fragments of a shattered mirror, that when carefully examined, revealed something far more sinister lurking beneath the surface. Agatha knew that within the town's deceptively polite conversations and carefully constructed facades lay a web of secrets waiting to be unearthed. She could almost taste the deceit in the air, thick and suffocating. Yet her sharp mind and relentless drive were undeterred. No matter how deeply these secrets were buried, Agatha was certain that they wouldn't stay hidden for long in the watchful, sharp-eyed community of Willowview. The morning sun stretched across the main street like a golden ribbon, casting pale, elongated shadows across the town. The fresh blanket of snow shimmered beneath the pale light, softening the sharp outlines of the buildings, and turning everything into a fragile reflection of itself. Yet despite the festive preparations for Groundhog Day, an undercurrent of unease gripped Willowview. A quiet, almost imperceptible shift in the atmosphere that spoke louder than words. People moved more slowly, their smiles less convincing, their greetings softer and more guarded. It was as if the town itself had absorbed the weight of the recent tragedy, and had yet to shake it off. In the corner of the Silver Spoon Café, a modest, homey establishment with checkered tablecloths and brass fixtures, sat Calvin Morris. His presence had once been familiar, an integral part of Willowview's social fabric, but his return a year ago had brought with it an air of uncertainty. He had sought solace in this quiet corner of the world, after a past marred by scandal and missteps, hoping to rebuild. But today his presence seemed charged with an unfamiliar tension. His broad shoulders, once a testament to physical labor, now carried a heavier burden, one unseen but ever present. His dark hair, neatly combed, still held traces of rebellion, with a few stray strands falling over his brow, hinting at a restless mind. A thin scar above his left eyebrow stood as a quiet reminder of a confrontation he rarely spoke of, and his hazel eyes, always intense, flickered nervously, betraying an inner turmoil that he was clearly trying to keep concealed. Agatha stepped into the café, with the grace of someone accustomed to observing the delicate balance of social dynamics. Her entrance was met with a brief hush, the conversations around the room momentarily pausing before resuming in hushed tones. It was as if the townspeople were subconsciously aware of her presence, aware of her ability to unravel the truths they were all so desperately trying to hide. She made her way to Calvin's table, her steps measured and deliberate, before taking a seat opposite him. "Good afternoon, Mr. Morris," she greeted, her voice warm but carrying an undercurrent of quiet inquiry. Calvin looked up, his expression hardening for a moment before softening ever so slightly as he recognized her. "Miss Marple," he nodded curtly, his eyes narrowing slightly. "To what do I owe the pleasure?" Agatha didn't waste time with pleasantries. "I was hoping we could speak privately," she said, her gaze never leaving his. "There are a few matters regarding Mr. Parkhurst's passing that I believe you might be able to shed some light on." Calvin's jaw tightened at the mention of Martin Parkhurst's name, and he glanced around the café quickly before leaning in closer, lowering his voice. "I imagine you have your questions," he murmured, his tone guarded. "But I assure you, Miss Marple, I had nothing but respect for Martin." Agatha raised an eyebrow. sensing the unease that lingered just below his words. Respect, yes, she agreed, her voice gentle but sharp. But I understand that there were complexities in your relationship. Calvin sighed, rubbing the bridge of his nose, as though the weight of the past was suddenly upon him. Complexities indeed, he muttered. Martin helped me when I was at my lowest, lent me the money to get back on my feet. But there was always a reminder, a way of making sure I never forgot that debt. It was constant. Agatha nodded, her eyes narrowing as she processed his words. Such reminders can be burdensome, she said softly, her gaze probing his. Did these reminders ever lead to disagreements between you and Mr. Parkhurst? Calvin hesitated, his eyes briefly flickering with something darker before he nodded slowly. We had our arguments. Martin had big ideas for the festival, for expanding it, bringing in more tourists. But I didn't see it that way. I wanted to preserve the town's charm, not turn it into some commercialized spectacle. His voice hardened, a hint of anger breaking through his otherwise calm demeanor. But it was never more than that. We disagreed, yes. But I didn't come here to stir up old conflicts. I came here to rebuild, not reignite past tensions. Agatha watched him closely as he spoke, noting the subtle shifts in his expression, the way his irritation would flare only to be quickly suppressed, the brief flashes of anger that softened into something more controlled. It was a dance she had seen before, a carefully crafted mask hiding emotions that ran much deeper. Are you sure, Mr. Morris? She asked, her tone quiet but insistent. Are you certain there were no other complications? Calvin's eyes met hers, and for a moment, something in his gaze seemed to flicker, like a secret he was unwilling to confront. But he quickly masked it, leaning back in his chair with a forced calmness. I assure you, Miss Marple, he said, his voice firm. Nothing more than a few professional disagreements. Nothing worth your time. But Agatha wasn't convinced. As their conversation continued, she couldn't shake the feeling that Calvin was hiding something, that beneath his stoic exterior was a man who knew far more than he was willing to admit. The clues were there, scattered just out of reach, and Agatha's mind raced to piece them together. The tension in the cafe was palpable, thick with unspoken truths, and as she watched Calvin, she realized that her journey into the heart of Willow View's secrets had only just begun. This was no simple town mystery. This was a story of buried resentments, unspoken fears, and dangerous alliances, and Agatha Marple was determined to uncover it all. Outside, the snow continued its relentless descent, blanketing Willow View in a silent shroud that amplified the town's isolation. Inside the warmth of the cafe, the contrast was stark, the heat from the crackling fire fighting the chill of the outside world. Yet there was a palpable tension that seeped through the walls. Calvin Morris sat across from Agatha, his eyes shadowed by the weight of unspoken thoughts. His coffee, now cold, mirrored the distance that had grown between him and the life he once knew. Agatha let the silence hang, her gaze unwavering as she measured his every move. Do you think anyone in town felt torn between gratitude and resentment towards Martin? She asked, her voice smooth but laced with intent. Calvin's eyes flickered, the faintest crack in his otherwise composed demeanor, as he struggled with the question. If there was anyone, it wasn't me, he muttered, his voice thick with frustration. Martin was fair, but his ambitions, they always had a way of overshadowing the rest of us. If someone took advantage of that, I wouldn't know. Agatha's mind clicked as she processed his words, sincere yet carefully constructed, an attempt to distance himself from the shadows of suspicion. Thank you, Mr. Morris, she said, standing. Her eyes remained fixed on him as she added, your perspective is valuable. As she turned to leave, Calvin's hand caught hers, a firm, urgent grip that sent a chill through her. If you need anything at all. His voice trailed off, the words left hanging like a promise, or perhaps a plea. We want this town to thrive again, he added, his voice breaking through the veneer of stoicism. Agatha offered a polite smile, but inside, her mind churned. Calvin's redemption arc had begun, marked by his desire to shed the ghosts of his past, and prove his worth to a community that had once shunned him. Yet in the shadow of Martin's death, old fears and suspicions were rising once again, threatening to drag Calvin back into the role of the outcast. Stepping back into the hustle of Main Street, Agatha felt the weight of her task pressing down on her. Willow View, with its pristine streets and its seemingly tight-knit community, held more secrets than anyone could imagine. Calvin Morris was just one piece of the puzzle, a mere thread in the intricate tapestry that Agatha needed to unravel. Each conversation, each interaction brought her closer to the heart of the mystery, and she knew she was only scratching the surface. As she passed the cafe door, it jingled softly behind her, the sound oddly final, marking the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. Her thoughts lingered on Calvin's words, his struggle for redemption and the shadows that continued to follow him. Was his fight simply a reflection of his past mistakes, or was it the town itself, always quick to suspect those who dared to return? The answers lay hidden, buried beneath the layers of Willow View's facade, its charm masking something darker and far more complex. The Parkhurst residence, with its grand drawing rooms and velvet-draped windows, felt like a gilded cage, a place of opulence and suffocating pressure. The ornate fireplace crackled softly, casting fleeting shadows that seemed to mock the tension that clung to the air. Agatha sat in the plush armchair, poised yet relaxed, as her first interview of the day began. Dorothy Parkhurst entered the room with hesitant steps, her eyes darkened from sleepless nights, her shoulders weighed down by an invisible burden. She settled into a chair across from Agatha, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, the atmosphere growing heavier with every passing second. "Mrs. Parkhurst," Agatha began gently, "thank you for agreeing to speak with me." Dorothy offered a fragile smile, but her eyes, heavy with unspoken grief, betrayed the turmoil within. "Of course, Miss Marple. I just want to know what happened to Martin." Agatha nodded sympathetically, her voice soft as she pressed further. "I'd like to revisit the evening before Martin's death. Could you walk me through your last moments with him?" Dorothy's breath caught in her throat as she spoke, her voice shaky. "We had dinner, like we always do on Fridays. It was quiet, but Martin seemed distracted. He kept glancing at his watch and muttering something about meeting someone that evening." Agatha's sharp eyes studied Dorothy, noting the subtle tremor in her hands. "Did he mention who he was meeting?" she asked, leaning forward. Dorothy shook her head slowly, her gaze dropping to her lap. "No, just that it was urgent. I thought he was preoccupied with the festival preparations." Agatha's instincts kicked in. Were there any disagreements or tensions between Martin and anyone else recently? Dorothy hesitated, her gaze faltering as she struggled to find the right words. The room seemed to close in on her, the heavy drapes and opulent decor offering no comfort, only a reminder of the secrets buried within its walls. The evening air outside was thick with snow, enveloping Willow View in a heavy silence, the kind that only deepened the sense of isolation creeping into the hearts of its residents. Inside the cafe, the contrast couldn't have been more pronounced, the warmth and soft glow of the lights against the stark haunting chill of Martin Parkhurst's death. As Agatha sat opposite Calvin, she allowed the moment to stretch, the steam from his coffee curling upwards in a way that felt almost symbolic, like the secret swirling beneath the surface of every word. Her voice was soft but deliberate, as she inquired about any lingering resentment towards Martin, knowing full well that the mask of civility often concealed the sharpest of wounds. Calvin's gaze shifted uneasily, his response quick but lacking the warmth one might expect from someone truly grieving. "If there were any, it wasn't from me," he said, his voice a little too controlled. "Martin's ambition often overshadowed our personal ties, but I can't imagine anyone holding anything against him. Not enough to cause harm anyway." Agatha made a mental note, observing the way his words seemed rehearsed, as if he was guarding himself from an accusation that hadn't yet been made. As she stood to leave, his grip on her hand lingered, just long enough to offer a sense of urgency beneath the politeness. "If you need anything, don't hesitate to reach out," he said, his voice smooth. But there was an undercurrent to it, an invitation veiled in subtle pressure. Agatha nodded, her thoughts already racing through the layers of what she had just heard. Calvin's redemption story, if genuine, was now tangled with old suspicions that threatened to pull him back into the shadows of the past, especially in a town like Willow View, where every face had a history, and every action could be scrutinized through the lens of its collective memory. The town's charm, a comforting facade, hid the deepest of secrets, and as Agatha stepped back onto the snow-covered streets, her mind swirled with the complexity of what she had just learned. Calvin Morris's struggle to redeem himself had more layers than he had admitted, and there was something unsettling about the way he tried to present himself as an outsider. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that he was too tightly woven into the town's fabric to escape suspicion so easily. Later, as she arrived at the Parkhurst residence, the grandeur of the home only served to magnify the tension in the air. The drawing room, with its heavy velvet drapes and flickering firelight, felt less like a sanctuary and more like a gilded cage, its opulence constricting. Dorothy Parkhurst entered with hesitant steps, her eyes shadowed by sleepless nights, her hands nervously clasped in her lap. When Agatha asked her about the night before Martin's death, Dorothy's voice trembled slightly as she spoke of their quiet dinner, of Martin's distracted glances at his watch, of an urgent meeting he seemed determined not to share the details of. He kept saying it was urgent, Dorothy recalled, her hands betraying her nerves. But he wouldn't tell me who he was meeting. Agatha pressed, sensing the deep current of anxiety flowing beneath the surface. Was there any tension between Martin and anyone else, perhaps recently? Dorothy's answer came after a long pause. There was some disagreement with Jonathan Wicks over the festival's direction, she said softly. Martin wanted to keep the town's traditions, but Jonathan wanted to expand. The conflict wasn't new. Agatha made a note of it. But the cracks in Dorothy's story didn't escape her. Was it grief she was hiding? Or something more? After the interview ended, Agatha turned her attention to Jonathan Wicks, who arrived with a sense of self-assured grace that seemed to infuriate the air itself. His tailored suit spoke of wealth and power, and his every movement exuded control. But Agatha wasn't fooled. Beneath the polished exterior lay something darker, something unsettling. As they discussed Martin's vision for the festival, and Jonathan's desire to expand it, Agatha couldn't help but notice the tension in his voice, a barely concealed irritation at Martin's reluctance to embrace change. Martin resisted progress, Jonathan admitted, his eyes flashing with irritation. He feared that large-scale changes would strip the festival of its essence. But without growth, how could Willow View survive? The animosity was palpable, and Agatha couldn't help but ask the pressing question, did you think Martin would go to any extreme to stop the expansion? Jonathan's answer came quickly, but Agatha noted the slight twitch in his jaw. No, he said, almost too quickly. Martin wasn't that kind of man. But as Agatha listened, she couldn't shake the feeling that there was more beneath the surface, a quiet bitterness that could have driven someone to extreme measures. As their conversation ended, and Jonathan stood to leave, Agatha observed a subtle limp in his step, a small detail, but one that felt out of place with his otherwise impeccable appearance. It was a clue, faint yet present, and Agatha tucked it away in the back of her mind. As she sat back in her chair, her thoughts spun in circles. The pieces were starting to fit together, but the puzzle was far from complete. Dorothy's nervously inconsistent story, Jonathan's clipped responses, and the mystery of Martin's final hours. The more Agatha uncovered, the more she felt like she was skating on the edge of a much darker truth, hidden beneath layers of deception, grief and ambition. The town's quiet facade masked a storm of secrets, and Agatha was determined to unravel every last thread, no matter how deep it went. Agatha's investigation was still in its early stages, but the weight of Willow View's secrets was already bearing down on her, thickening the air as much as the snow that blanketed the town. Each passing moment seemed to deepen the mystery surrounding Martin Parkhurst's death, and Agatha could sense that every individual she spoke to was guarding something. Each word, every gesture, a clue, or perhaps a carefully crafted lie. As she moved forward with her interviews, she found herself sifting through a complex maze of emotions, motivations, and contradictions, all veiled behind the town's seemingly picturesque facade. The grand library of the Parkhurst residence, its towering bookshelves and dark mahogany paneling, exuded an atmosphere of old-world charm, but felt stifling, almost claustrophobic as Agatha settled into her chair, ready for her next conversation. Kelly Stokes, the town's passionate zookeeper, entered with a purposeful stride that contrasted sharply with the room's luxurious decor. She wore her olive green parka as though it were armor, her dark hair pulled tightly back in a ponytail, the practicality of her appearance a stark reminder of her no-nonsense nature. Yet there was an unmistakable tension in her posture, something off in the way she carried herself, as though she were bracing against an unseen storm. Agatha noted this, her sharp eyes catching every flicker of discomfort. "I trust the arrangements here are satisfactory, despite the circumstances." Agatha's voice was calm, inviting, though the undercurrent of tension was undeniable. Kelly's voice was steady, but there was an edge to it, a frustration that lingered in her words. "I just want to help in any way I can," she said, her hands tightly clasped in her lap, betraying the calm exterior she tried to maintain. Agatha leaned forward, her gaze unwavering. "I understand you had a disagreement with Martin regarding Winston's enclosure. Can you elaborate on that?" Kelly's expression shifted, her eyes dropping to her hands before she spoke again, her voice tinged with emotion. "Martin wanted to move Winston to a larger enclosure. He thought the festival's expansion would bring more visitors, and we needed the space for them. But I opposed it. Winston's routine is vital to him, and I didn't believe the move would be beneficial. I voiced my concerns repeatedly, but Martin was insistent. He didn't care. He made up his mind." Agatha could hear the lingering frustration in Kelly's words, and her mind immediately began to process the layers beneath the surface. "And after this disagreement, what happened?" Agatha pressed, her tone gently coaxing. Kelly sighed, her shoulders slumping slightly as though the weight of the memory was too much. "I left his study feeling unsettled," Kelly admitted, her voice low. "But I swear, I didn't harm him. I just wanted what was best for Winston." Agatha studied Kelly's eyes, looking for any hint of hesitation or deceit, but there was none. The sincerity in her voice rang true, yet the nagging sense that something was being held back lingered in the air. "Were there any unusual noises or signs of distress during your conversation with Martin?" Agatha asked, pushing further. Kelly's gaze flickered briefly before she answered, her words clipped. "There were raised voices. Martin was more agitated than usual, but there was no one else, just the two of us." Agatha's mind raced as she jotted down the details. The raised voices and Martin's agitated demeanor, a significant piece of the puzzle. "Thank you, Kelly. Your dedication to Winston is commendable, and your insights are invaluable." As Kelly rose to leave, Agatha couldn't shake the fleeting shadow of worry that crossed her face, a hint of something more beneath her protective exterior. Was it truly fear for Winston, or was there something darker lurking in her past, something she wasn't willing to reveal? Just as the door to the library swung open once more, Agatha was ready to move on to the next interview, her mind already processing the information she had gathered. Lawrence Atkins, the town historian, stepped into the room with a quiet authority that seemed out of place in the lavish setting. He was clad in a perfectly pressed tweed blazer, the elbows worn from years of use, a testament to his scholarly pursuits. His silver hair was neatly combed, and his wire-rimmed spectacles perched precariously on the bridge of his nose, giving him a look of perpetual focus. In his hand, he carried a leather-bound notebook, the weight of which seemed to symbolize his meticulous nature. Agatha couldn't help but notice how his very presence commanded attention, his composed demeanor belying the tension that seemed to hang in the air between them. "Good morning, Mr. Atkins." Agatha greeted him warmly, her voice steady as she gestured to the chair opposite her. "Please, join us." Lawrence offered a polite nod, settling into the chair, his movements slow and deliberate. "Good morning, Miss Marple," he replied, his voice measured and precise. "I trust you are finding Willow View as charming as ever, despite the unfortunate circumstances." Agatha studied him intently, sensing the subtle currents of unease beneath his calm exterior. "I'd like to discuss your relationship with Martin Parkhurst, particularly your views on the festival's direction," she said, her tone all business now. Lawrence adjusted his glasses and sighed, the briefest flicker of emotion crossing his face. "Martin was a visionary in his own right," he began, his voice calm but tinged with something Agatha couldn't quite place. "He loved Willow View, and his dedication to the town was unmatched. However, we had differing opinions on the future of the festival. Martin believed in preserving the town's traditional values, keeping things quaint and familiar. I, on the other hand, believed we needed to modernize, to bring in more tourists, increase revenue, and ensure the survival of the town's traditions in a changing world." Agatha leaned forward, her eyes narrowing as she processed his words. "Was this disagreement recent? Had it escalated?" she asked. Lawrence nodded slowly, the wariness in his eyes revealing just how deeply the tension had affected him. "Yes, to some extent. Martin was resistant to large-scale changes, fearing it would dilute the festival's authenticity. I argued that expansion was necessary for survival, but our discussions often became heated. I fear this may have played a role in his death," he said quietly, his voice tinged with regret. Agatha studied him carefully, noting the faint tremor in his hand as he rested it on the table. "Did you ever believe that Martin might take drastic measures to prevent the festival's expansion?" Agatha's question hung in the air. Lawrence hesitated for a moment, before shaking his head. "No, Martin was a man of integrity. I couldn't imagine him resorting to violence, even if our disagreements had become tense." Agatha absorbed his words, her mind piecing together the fragments of the puzzle. "On the night of his death, did you have any direct interaction with Martin?" she asked, her voice gentle but insistent. Lawrence's gaze flickered momentarily before he responded. "We met briefly to discuss some final details about the festival's budget. It was a cordial meeting, though admittedly tense. Martin was more stressed than usual, but we agreed that our financial contributions would help support his plans, not undermine them." Agatha made a mental note of the timeline and the nature of their meeting. "Was anyone else present during your conversation?" she asked. Lawrence shook his head. "No, only the regular staff. Martin trusted them implicitly. If someone had entered his study, it would have been someone we all knew well." Agatha nodded thoughtfully, her mind racing through the possibilities. "Thank you, Mr. Atkins. Your insights are most helpful." As Lawrence left the library, Agatha felt a flicker of something strange in his demeanor, a subtle shift in his posture that suggested more was at play here than simple disagreements over the festival. Agatha marveled at how the clues were beginning to weave together in her mind. The raised voices, the simmering tensions, the veiled emotions, all of it pointed to a deeper, more complex mystery that was waiting to be uncovered. As the snow continued to fall, the layers of Willow View's secrets seemed to thicken, but Agatha knew that each interview, each subtle clue, would bring her one step closer to the truth. The town's festive exterior was only a mask, and beneath it, Agatha was certain, lay a storm waiting to be unraveled. Agatha's investigation had gained momentum, but she was still left with far too many unanswered questions, each conversation peeling back a new layer of secrecy. The atmosphere of Willow View weighed heavily on her as she shifted through each person's testimony, looking for that elusive thread that would unravel the entire mystery. When Agatha entered the study to speak with Lawrence Atkins, she sensed the tension hanging in the air, thicker than the morning fog that had begun to settle outside. Lawrence, a man of precise and deliberate movements, had an air of scholarly focus that both reassured and unnerved her. He opened his notebook with meticulous care, his glasses perched delicately on the bridge of his nose, eyes scanning for the right words to describe his relationship with Martin Parkhurst. "We were finalizing the historical exhibits for the festival," Lawrence explained, the edges of his mouth curling into a thin smile, his voice steady. Martin was always passionate about preserving Willowview's heritage, and our collaboration had been harmonious. Agatha leaned forward, carefully watching the way he spoke, his eyes flicking to the pages of his notebook. There was a hint of something buried beneath his practiced calm, a possible evasion. But were there any moments that evening where you felt tension, any disagreement with Martin? She asked. Lawrence's smile faltered for just a moment, before he answered with a controlled tone. No, Miss Marple. Our collaboration was perfectly cordial. Martin had some last-minute ideas, a detailed account of Willowview's founding families, which he was quite excited about. It was a small addition, but meaningful. Agatha raised an eyebrow, her gaze sharpening. So no unusual tensions, no heated arguments. Lawrence hesitated, shifting in his seat slightly. No, he said again, though Agatha could tell there was a slight rigidity in his posture. At least none that I would consider significant. I did leave the study briefly, but only for a short break around 10 o'clock. I returned to find everything in order. Agatha's mind raced as she processed his words. His alibi was flawless, almost too flawless. She could sense the undercurrent of evasion, the carefully chosen words that skirted around anything that might be important. And were you alone when you returned? Anyone else could have accessed the study during that time? Agatha pressed. Lawrence shook his head firmly, his expression betraying no sign of doubt. No one. Only the regular staff had access to the house, and Martin trusted them implicitly. If anyone had entered, I would have known. Agatha let the silence linger for a moment, letting the weight of his words settle in. Something felt off. Thank you, Mr. Atkins. Your cooperation is much appreciated, she said, her tone measured. As Lawrence stood to leave, Agatha couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something was being concealed, that his perfect recollection of the evening was more than just a sign of meticulousness. There was a hidden depth to his calm demeanor, something darker lurking beneath the surface. With Lawrence's departure, Agatha turned her attention to Calvin Morris, the man who had requested a private meeting in the town's modest library. The building stood in stark contrast to the opulence of the Parkhurst estate, its simple, unadorned brick facade, and large windows exuding a quiet practicality. Inside, Calvin sat at a small table, his broad shoulders hunched slightly, an aura of tension and unease surrounding him. Agatha could feel the heaviness in the air as she sat down across from him, noting the slight tremor in his hands, and the guarded expression in his hazel eyes. Mr. Morris, thank you for agreeing to meet, Agatha said softly, her voice calm yet probing. I understand you're eager to clear your name regarding Martin's death. Please, tell me about the evening in question. Calvin took a slow, steadying breath, his fingers tapping nervously against his coffee cup. After my shift at the workshop, I went to Martin's office to discuss some outstanding debt, he explained, his voice low but steady. I needed to assure him I was making progress on repaying it. Agatha observed the subtle fidgeting of his hands, the unease in his voice. Did Martin seem agitated? Was there any tension between you two? She asked, her voice soft but insistent. Calvin hesitated before answering, a brief flicker of guilt passing through his eyes. At first, yes, he admitted. Martin was upset about the delays in the repayment. He was insisting on stricter timelines. But we managed to work something out. He promised to extend the deadline, given my situation. Agatha leaned forward, watching him closely. And was this conversation civil? Did you leave on good terms? Calvin's expression faltered. Yes, but there was something about it that didn't sit right with me. Martin seemed distracted, almost distant, like he was preoccupied with something else. Agatha's mind began to churn, piecing together the information from his testimony. Did you leave the office right after? Were you in the building long after your conversation? Calvin shook his head quickly, almost too quickly. No, I left soon after. I didn't stick around. Agatha nodded. but her mind was working overtime. The discrepancies were subtle, but they were there, lurking in the shadows of Calvin's account. As she wrapped up the interview, she felt the threads of mystery pulling tighter, each person adding a piece to the complex puzzle that was Martin Parkhurst's death. Everyone had their own secrets, their own motivations, and Agatha was certain that the truth was buried beneath the polished exteriors and perfectly constructed alibis. The deeper she dug, the more she could sense that something far more sinister was at play, and she was determined to uncover it, no matter where it led. Agatha sat in the dimly lit study, the soft ticking of the clock filling the silence as she reviewed her notes. The room, with its plush velvet drapes and gleaming mahogany furniture, seemed almost alien in its contrast to the quiet turmoil unraveling in Willow View. She glanced at the pages in front of her, each one revealing layers of complexity that she had to sift through. Lawrence Atkins had spoken with unnerving precision, detailing his evening with a meticulousness that felt too rehearsed. His account of working with Martin, finalizing the festival's historical exhibits, remained flawless. No cracks, no hesitation. Yet Agatha sensed something amiss in his perfect recollections, something he wasn't saying, hidden behind the cool reserve of his scholarly demeanor. His mention of the minor addition about Willow View's founding families seemed trivial, but his excitement over it, the way he lingered on the details, suggested it meant more to him than he was willing to admit. Then there was Calvin Morris, who wore his nervousness like a cloak. His desire to clear his name was palpable, but his history in Willowview, still tainted by his past mistakes, cast a shadow over every word he spoke. His admission of stopping by Martin's office to discuss his debt repayment was plausible, but there was a tension in his voice when Agatha asked about Martin's willingness to extend the deadline. A hesitant pause, a shift in posture. Calvin's unease was almost tangible, the weight of his past mistakes pressing on him like a physical burden. Agatha had noted how, despite his protests, his story seemed carefully crafted, his defense too rehearsed, as if he were hiding something. His lack of an alibi, beyond a vague mention of returning home, left too many gaps. No one had seen him after he left Martin's office, and no one could confirm his whereabouts until morning. The town's suspicion of him was obvious, but his behavior suggested more than just a desire to prove himself. There was a hidden desperation in his actions. The more Agatha thought about it, the more she suspected that the answer lay not in Calvin's past, but in his present dealings with Martin. Perhaps Martin had known something, had seen something that might have forced Calvin's hand. As she pieced together the stories of Dorothy Parkhurst, Jonathan Wicks, Kelly Stokes and the rest, the image of a town locked in secrets and half-truths grew clearer. Each interview, each subtle shift in body language, each offhand remark, contributed to the growing tension. The scarf found on Calvin, the raised voices overheard by Dorothy, the unshakable calm of Lawrence, each piece of the puzzle, seemingly insignificant alone, formed a web that Agatha was determined to unravel. The clock struck once more, its steady rhythm a reminder that time was slipping away, and the mystery of Martin's death was far from solved. As dusk settled over Willowview, casting long eerie shadows across the snow-covered streets, Agatha knew that every step she took forward only uncovered more questions. She would not rest until she pierced the veil of deception that shrouded this town, until the truth emerged from beneath the layers of lies. The stakes were higher now. Every decision, every word, every clue could be the key to unlocking the dark heart of the mystery. And as she prepared for the next phase of her investigation, Agatha felt the weight of the secrets pressing down on her, pushing her further into the labyrinth of Willowview's tangled history. The path ahead promised danger and revelations in equal measure, but her resolve remained unshaken. This was a puzzle she was determined to solve, no matter where it led.